Hello, folks. My name is Robert North. This is a university video course of 24 lessons that teach a practical, non-dogmatic, positive way to live. That way, and I put it in quotes, was taught over 2,000 years ago by Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus. I call it the way of the soul. It has been misunderstood and worse, twisted into what they did not envision. Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus did not found dogmatic religions as we have been taught. They saw the same religious, political, and social conflicts that we suffer. They also witnessed people conflicted within with emotional problems. As wise, practical therapists, they lived and preached the same practical, revolutionary solution. In this video series, you will learn their way of the soul to an empowered life. With it, you will contribute to world peace. I can promise you that you will also be so much more wise, loving, and fulfilled. You are looking right now at the title page of the first lesson. It contains the two fundamental insights of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus. First, they understood that dogma truths divide. When we personally are attached to two opposed dogmas, we become emotionally conflicted. When two groups differ in their dogmas, they become conflicted. That's the world today. Their solution: stop identifying with dogma and instead enable Spirit to reveal both the real empowered you and how you can live fulfilled. In other words, they're telling us, stop being guided by the dogma of others and by the dogma we create in our own mind. And instead, we need to discover our own answers with the help of Spirit. Now, right now, let me define the two words. Eve is my name for the author of the Garden of Eden allegory, which we will be studying. We really don't know who wrote that story. But because there's so much femininity in the story, I call the author Eve. It contains the secret of living a fulfilled life, also the secret of resolving conflicts between groups. I also use the word Spirit instead of God. We call God by many names like Allah, Jehovah. All through the course, I will be using the word Spirit. Now, Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus articulated what they called a way, not a religion, a way out of dogma and onto a way to be Spirit-led to an empowered life. If we were all Spirit-led in the moment like they will teach us in this course, to discover our own ever-evolving answers, there would be no conflict in the world. In other words, they found the solution. This course is going to show that in the Bible, there are in fact two methodologies. One we all call religion, which is dogma-based religion, such as we find in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and in most other religions in the world. But that is only part of the Bible. Another methodology in the Bible that most people do not see, and it's also in other ancient literature, such as the early writings of Buddha, is an anti-dogma way. This course will show that it was this methodology and not religion that was taught by Abraham, Buddha, Eve, and Jesus. In other words, they would not endorse dogma religion. And other dogma-based organizations and the resulting conflicts. Now that's different than what most everyone thinks. Abraham would not endorse Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Jesus would not endorse Christianity or any other dogma-based religion. Neither would Buddha, nor would Eve. That'll all be shown through their quotes in this course. Now, some people go on the way of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus on their own, and they don't know they're doing that. They do that, for example, when they go on a retreat, and they just let spirit guide them rather than the teachings of a religion or of a spirituality. Some people completely drop out of, quote, organized religion, but they don't and try to live completely on the way of independence. But most people get trapped in social dogma. Facebook dogma, our newspaper is full of dogma, teaches us dogma, our political parties teach us dogma, our advertising teaching us dogma. But to be able to recognize dogma and to know how to not identify with it, that is the nature of this course, and is what was being taught by Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus. You may be asking why you have not heard of the way that is being taught in the Bible and in other ancient literature. The answer concerns this book that you see here, called The Semitic Secret, how biblical authors organize their books to include both a dictionary, commentary, and a method to disclose scribal errors. This book shows how to discern the organization of ancient wisdom works like the Bible and like the Gospel of Thomas and like the ancient wisdom poems of Buddha. Ancient authors organized their books not by chapter and verses like we see in the Bible, and often not by long paragraphs like we see in Buddhist poems. But as we see here below the title, in the Bible, almost the entire Bible is organized in columns of stanzas. We never see that. We see long column after column kind of newspaper columns. That is not how they organized the Bible. To understand the Bible this way, you read down and you read horizontally. In the horizontal, we read in parallel. In that way, the authors of the Bible in particular define their key metaphors and present a commentary. Most people do not know that most of the words in the Bible are metaphors. And we can't understand the Bible without understanding those metaphors. Buddha used metaphors for all of his important words. And again, if you use the methodology in this book, you can understand the meaning of Buddha's metaphors also. Let me give you an example. By reading the Garden of Eden story horizontally and vertically, we understand the metaphorical meaning of the term Garden of Eden. It is not a place. It's a way of being. We also understand the metaphorical meaning of the two trees in the garden, of the snake in the garden, of what it means to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. What are fig leaves? Fig leaves are not actual leaves. The story presents them as leaves, but they actually metaphorically mean something else. When we understand the meaning of those metaphors, the meaning of the allegory completely changes. We're going to go through, in this course, line by line, the Garden of Eden allegory, and you're going to be very surprised at what we're going to discover. This book was just published, about 9 months ago. It's being reviewed by my colleagues. It'll probably be a couple of years before the final it gets final approval or partial approval, because the implications are significant. To say that we haven't been reading the Bible correctly is a very strong statement. That has implications for all the theology and research of the past years. However, right now, I want to allow people to read 40% of the book by downloading a PDF off of the website. So you can read a great deal of the book and decide if you want it in your library. In this video course, I'm going to explain over 50 metaphors. So you will have a good grasp at the end of the course of how to read the metaphors in the Bible and in Buddhist poems. This course will be primarily supported by the book you see here. It's entitled The Second Coming of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, Their Lost Way to Personal and Global Peace. Notice the tree of life on the cover. It is prominent because I believe that the Garden of Eden allegory is one of the foundation stones of ancient wisdom literature throughout the world. This book presents in depth and in greater detail what you're going to see in this course of videos. Leaders could be helped by this book to lead discussions. I found that the videos themselves present a lot of information that can be best integrated by people in a discussion group. So there's people right now using the videos and the book for Zoom discussions, and later they hope to have personal discussions around the videos and around the book. We're looking here at Abraham. We will study the Abraham allegory in Genesis. It also contains the secret for how to live a fulfilled life without conflict. You've heard of the covenant. The covenant of Abraham has been very misunderstood. It actually is a formula for personal peace and world peace. We'll study that in depth. We see here a picture of Buddha, and we are going to be using primarily the wisdom poems in one of his earliest works, the earliest collections of his works, called the Dhammapada. It was collected about 300 years, the collection of his poems were about 300 years after Buddha died. I might just say that many people quote Buddha, but they don't quote his early wisdom poems. They're quoting people who came after Buddha. We're going to quote Buddha. You're looking here at the Gospel of Thomas book that I translated. We will study the insights of Jesus as found in this book. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered buried in Egypt in 1945. The very first line states that Jesus composed it. That's remarkable. I was able to use the principles in the Semitic Secret book to find its organization and the meaning of the metaphors. It is almost all metaphors, all wisdom poems by Jesus. As you can see on the front cover, the book is arranged into 21 chapters that are laid out in an arch. In the appendix to the book, I present 14 reasons to believe that Jesus did in fact write it. Yes, that's something that no one knows, or very few know. Jesus left us a book. Understanding the organization of this book is essential for understanding his metaphors. It's also essential for understanding his way. His way is presented in the Gospel of Thomas more than in the New Testament. To give you an example of how you use the organization to find the meaning of a metaphor, in the chapter 1, the word twin is a metaphorical term that is used twice, but it is not defined in chapter 1. But if we look horizontally in parallel to chapter 21, it is defined in 3 wisdom poems. So that's how we know the meaning of the word twin. You're seeing here a timeline of when Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus lived. Eve lived 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Abraham lived in about 1800 BCE. We don't know when his story was written down. Many think that it was about 500 BCE. Buddha lived around 475 BCE. Jesus was born in about 4 BCE, and then he died around 30 CE. Jesus clearly knew Buddha's wisdom poems. He uses the same metaphors. He also knew the rest of the Old Testament and used the metaphors in the Old Testament. Buddha definitely knew Eve's Garden of Eden story. He sat under the Bodhi tree to receive enlightenment. That was probably his name for the tree of the knowledge of life. We will see that Abraham taught how to return to the Garden of Eden. I don't see any evidence that Buddha knew about Abraham, but he certainly knew about Eve and the Garden of Eden. In summary, the later authors, like Jesus, built upon the insights of the early authors. All 4 of them taught the same way out of dogma and into an empowered life. Let me show you how they build upon each other. Here we see a section from one of Buddha's poems. Buddha said, "Arise and watch. Follow the way joyfully through this world and beyond." The key metaphor here is the word world. Jesus said, "Whoever discovers himself on his own, the world is worthy of him not." They both use the word world, and when we read in parallel, both in Buddha's wisdom poems and in Jesus' wisdom poems, we find the definition of the word world. A world is made up of people who are brainwashed or indoctrinated by dogma, social dogma, political dogma, religious dogma, dogma from their families, from their social groups. People who largely are living unconsciously and not creating their own ideas, giving those ideas up, creating new ones. They live every day, day after day, pretty much the same way. On the way of Buddha and Jesus, people change from day to day. In summary, Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus said there were 2 ways to live: in the world and out of it. Their way was teaching people to leave the world. You see here a summary of their 2 ways to live. I call their way, the way of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, the way of the soul, because it's with soul inspiration that one finds his own ideas about how to think and act. The other way, the way of the world, I call the way of the mind, because we're living from the dogma that we have memorized. Now, over on the left-hand side, we read, "A person is led by spirit to discover his own answers." That's important. On the way, all the leaders Their primary goal is not to teach people ideas about how to think and act, but rather to empower them to use their soul inspiration to decide for themselves how to think and act. On the way of the mind, a person is taught to adopt the dogmas, the official dogmas and the answers of others, or to create his own mental dogmas. For example, a religion or a political party or a social group wants everybody to think and act the same, often. That's the way of the mind. A person can also use dogma ideas from this group, from that group, and that group, and make up his own dogmas, and then end up defending and promoting them without continually using spirit to challenge his ideas and evolve. Under the way of the soul, on the second line, a person continually changes his beliefs based on spirit-led revelation. So a person is constantly evolving. They're never the same from one day to the next. On the way of the mind, a person maintains steadfast faith. So in the world, steadfast faith or firm faith is prized and is rewarded. On the way of the soul, a person continually evolves his life as his truths change. So there are no absolute truths on the way of the soul. The person is constantly evolving them. When a person looks at something today, it isn't how he's going to see it tomorrow, and he knows that. On the way of the mind, a person remains relatively the same day after day as he defends and promotes his dogmas. Over on the way of the soul, a person adopts non-dogmatic spiritual practices that eventually lead people to unity. People are led to unity because they're all listening to spirit and they're not being divided by dogma. On the way of the mind, dogma-based organizations exist in conflict. The best they can do is tolerate other people's truths, and toleration is usually suppressed anger. On the way of the soul is taught by Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, and some organizations today. The way of the mind is taught by Moses, Paul, the Apostle, Mohammed, and most religions, political parties, and society today. What's important to note, and may come as a surprise to people, is that Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus never used the word believe, never used the word faith, by belief or faith and dogma. They did not form a creed. They did not teach a creed. They did not teach a legal book. It was a way. They did not use the word worship. They did not build houses of worship. If you ask Jesus, for example, what faith do you belong to, he would answer, I have faith in what Spirit teaches me in the moment. My faith evolves. So he doesn't have steadfast faith, and he didn't teach any kind of doctrine. I want to show you now how Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus mentioned the word way. They never mentioned the word religion, never used the word religion. Here's a passage from the Garden of Eden. God placed at the east of the Garden of Eden a cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned around to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, cherubim, the flaming sword, and the tree of life are all metaphors, which will be defined in the course. The sword guarded the way to the tree of life. So the whole purpose of the Garden of Eden story is how to live a fulfilled life. And there was a way to live it, and to live on that way, one must use a cherubim and get by the flaming sword in order to be fulfilled. Now, in the Genesis, in the story of Abraham, Spirit announced, "Know, for I, the Lord, have chosen him," who he means Abraham, "that he may lead his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." Now, in the course, the metaphors righteousness and justice will be explained. But notice that Abraham was not teaching a religion, he was teaching the way of the Lord. Now let's look at Buddha. In one of the Buddha's poems, he says, "The master abandons the dark way for the light way." Now the dark way is the way of the world. It's the way of the mind. The light way is the way of the soul. Throughout Buddha's poems, he talks about these two ways. You leave one way, which we're calling the way of dogma, to be on the other way, which is the way in which you make your individual choices in the moment with Spirit, without relying on former dogma. Now let's look at Jesus and his notion of the way. In Acts 9, 1 and 2, we read, "Meanwhile Saul," now Saul is Paul the Apostle. He was a Jewish cleric who never met Jesus, but came to Jerusalem shortly after Jesus died. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. So in Jerusalem, after Jesus died, there was a very small group of his disciples. They were led by his brother James. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. Now after Jesus was murdered, many of his disciples fled for fear for their lives, and they went to Damascus. So Saul is looking for permission from the Jewish establishment to go to Damascus to arrest these people who were on Jesus' way and bring them to Jerusalem so that they could be persecuted and even killed. So the Jewish establishment was terribly threatened by Jesus' way. Now here's something that's very interesting. For 2,000 years, theologians and others have discussed what is the nature of Jesus' way. And believe it or not, today, if you asked any theologian, any professor of religion, any cleric, you would not get a consistent answer to the question, what is Jesus' way? So right now we've got 1.2 billion Christians who think they're following Jesus' way, but no one knows what it is, or very few know what it is. By the time you finish this course, you will know not only what the way is, but how to live it. It is not being taught in seminaries, it's not being taught in universities. People don't even know what it is. And that's amazing. How can anybody claim to be following Jesus if they don't know what he was doing? We find another expression of the way in Mark 1:14. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. Again, if you asked anyone, theologians, professors, clerics, anyone, what is Jesus' gospel of God, you will not get consistent answers. People do not know. His gospel of God is another metaphor for his way. We get an indication of what the way does in Mark 3:34. Jesus says, the one having done the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So not the one having done the correct dogma, but one who has done the will of God as led by Spirit. So the way and the gospel of God involves using Spirit to know in the moment the will of God. That will be taught in this course. How to do that and what that means and the implications of it. This also applies to Buddha. Buddha was teaching the way. It has been transformed into a religion just like Christianity has been transformed into a religion. Buddha did not teach dogma, but you find plenty of dogma in Buddhism. So let me summarize or give you a preview of this course that will be over 24 lessons. We will examine the words of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, and others, such as Jacob, Moses, Joshua, and King David. And we're going to learn, number one, how to understand the meaning of metaphors in the Bible and other ancient literature. Number two, you're going to end up knowing the difference between the way of the soul and the way of the mind. And you will have a choice of what you want, of how you want to live. I'm going to be showing you in detail, based on the words of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, how to live the way of the soul. We're also going to learn how the ways of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus became hidden, and they were changed. Abraham is largely unknown. So is Eve, and so is the original. You won't find people today quoting the original poems of Buddha. At least I don't find them. Number five, we're going to learn how to achieve emotional and spiritual health. Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus were teaching the way of emotional health, how to resolve internal conflicts. That is the way of the soul. And finally, number six, we're going to learn how we can contribute to removing conflicts from the world. We can solve the problems of the world if we're unified, but there is only one way. That's what I'm going to argue from their words in this course. There is only one way to remove religious, and political conflicts from the world, and that is when everybody is living the way of the soul. There's supplemental things that you can do throughout the course. I suggest you go to our website, www.7771.org. There, number one, you can download and read 40% of the books. Number two, you can read the overview of the way of the soul and the way of the mind. If you go up to the top of the page, you'll see a link called Overview, and that might be helpful to you at this point to see the differences, the summary of the differences between the way of the soul and the way of the mind. It won't teach you how to live the way of the soul, but you'll see the differences. And number three, at the top of the page of the website, you can see a link to a self-examination. That will tell you to what degree you are on the way of the soul today. And it'll also give you an idea about whether you want to live on the way of the soul in the future. That finishes lesson one, folks. Please subscribe below. If you liked the lesson, click on like. If you have comments or questions, write those down below. I really enjoyed being with you today. Thank you for listening.